Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a hot minute since my last video, but things just kind of kept getting in the way, but we're here back again and hopefully we'll be able to produce some more videos on a fairly regular basis going forward. So in my last video, I talked about, I was going to make a separate video about the challenges and goals that I have set for both myself and for my channel. In my last video, I did mention that I read a lot, I love to read, and while that's true, it has certainly kind of fallen off the top of my priority list the last few years. Every year in December, I set myself the Goodreads reading challenge for the next year. Every year for the last several years, I have set myself a goal of 40 books to read, which I figure with full-time jobs, some side hustles that I'm trying to launch or relaunch, just general life stuff, 40 books should be easily obtainable, right? Right? And every year when I go to set that goal, I realize that not only have I missed that goal, I have far missed that goal. In fact, last year at 25 books read was the most books I had read in a year in a couple of years. That is really sad. So this year I set myself some goals to try and make reading more of a priority in my life. And I'm going to talk about those goals and what that's going to mean for my channel going forward. So the first goal I set for myself, I mentioned before that I'm a huge fantasy nut, love fantasy. That's the genre I reach for more often than anything else. But I wanted to read a little bit more outside of that. So I had the aha moment to look at the novels that were New York Times bestsellers the year I was born. And for those of you playing the home game, that was 1977. So there were 6 books on the list. Should be doable. We'll see when we come to December. So the first book on the list is Trinity by Leon Uris, and I have actually finished this book. Yay me, I finished a book this year. This is a multi-generational, multi-point view story of Ireland starting from the Irish potato famine in 1940 or 1844 to 1849, I believe were the years, all the way up to the Easter Rising of 1916. Basically, when Ireland split into Northern Ireland, very Protestant, still part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland, very Catholic and very not much part of the United Kingdom. We follow our 2 main characters, Conor Larkin and Seamus O'Neill, as they grow up from Ballyatogue, Ireland, go their separate journeys until they meet up again in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which is kind of the precursor to the Irish Republican Army. If I were at Barnes & Noble just skimming through the shelves, this would not have caught my eye. I mean, the spine says absolutely nothing. The cover, as you can see, says absolutely nothing. This would not have been on my radar at all. But I have to tell you, this is a fantastically written book. It is incredibly heartbreaking what happens to these characters. It is infuriating what happens to these characters. Even if I don't read any of the other books on the New York Times bestseller from that year, I am very, very glad that I read this book. I give it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The next book on my list for the year, also a very big bestseller for the year, is Colleen McCullough and the Thornbirds. This was, I believe, Australia's bestseller. 33 million copies sold. I think it's been like the main bestseller that's come out of Australia since then. This tells the story. This is also a multi-generational family in the Australian outback. Their trials and tribulations of trying to make a life in that pretty rugged terrain, and the love story between a priest and the daughter of the family, the Clearys, who watched this little girl grow up. So there is quite an age difference, kind of controversial. I'm hoping to be able to get through this. There was actually a miniseries that was made from this book that also did really, really well. This is almost a doorstopper in size. This one has like 700 pages to it, which if you look, this one right here, this is Trinity again, had 900 pages. This looks bigger, but it's actually 200 pages less. So this is also a doorstopper. I love me some doorstoppers, but we'll see how quickly I can get through this one. Next up on the list is Falconer by John Cheever. I really don't know much about this book. It tells the story of a man named Farragut, his crime and punishment, and his struggle to remain a man in a universe bent on beating him back into childhood. Apparently has grand themes of irony, unforced eloquence, and exhilarating humor. So, I mean, I'm intrigued. It won the Pulitzer Prize for 1977. It's also very short, so I should be able to blast through this pretty quickly. So, I know nothing about this book. We'll see how it turns out. The next book on the list is Oliver's Story by Eric Siegel. But wait, this is a sequel. So I technically have to read the first book, Love Story. This one is a traditional wealthy jock meets poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks. Love and tragedy ensue. This was made into a pretty successful movie starring Ryan O'Neal and Ally McGraw. The tagline is, "Love means never having to say you're sorry." So this one I will read first, then get to the actual New York Times bestseller. This is Oliver's Story. So this is wealthy jock and his side of events. So I'm really interested to see how much of a difference there is between these two books. And the last on the list for 1977 bestsellers is The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. I have a confession to make. I have not read Tolkien at all. I tried reading Fellowship of the Rings when the movie was announced. I got pretty much just slightly past the encounter with Tom Bombadil and put the book aside and haven't picked up any Tolkien since. So we're talking 15 years. I don't remember when the movies came out. He is a fantastic writer. His grasp of linguistics is just amazing. His world building is amazing. But man, his prose is dry. I couldn't get past another description of a field, a 3-page description of a field, so I finally just put the book aside. I have The Hobbit, and I do plan on trying to read that. I know it's more of a children's book, and maybe a little bit more accessible, but knowing Tolkien, probably not. But I'm going to eventually read that. So, The Silmarillion is the story of the creation of the world and of the First Age. This is kind of the precursor to The Lord of the Rings and the events that happened in those books, even a precursor to The Hobbit. So, I'm interested. It's kind of a history book, and I love history books, so we'll see how this entails. Next up, going back to my beloved fantasy genre, every year Reddit's fantasy subreddit does a book bingo challenge. I've never attempted it before. It is a bingo square, and instead of trying to do a row, diagonal, or whatnot, you have to try and fill the entirety of the board. And it's a way for one to branch out from your normal, maybe medieval style sword and sorcery fantasy to something that you may not have normally picked up on your own. So maybe it's a historical fantasy, a non-Western setting. So maybe it's something that is set in maybe ancient Japan or the Middle East instead of the typical medieval Western Europe kind of setting. Characters that are LGBTQ plus. It takes place in a single city, so it's not this vast epic fantasy that takes place across countries or across the world. So it's still set in fantasy, but it's trying to introduce you to different facets of fantasy. And last on my list for challenges for myself and for something for my channel is something that I came up with actually last year. I grew up going to high school in the 90s, and the big thing back then was like the teen horror genre. I'm talking Christopher Pike, Remember Me. I'm talking R.L. Stine with his Fear Street series, Lois Duncan, Stranger with My Face. So I picked up a couple of books that I remembered reading back in the early 90s. One of them, and I'll talk about it when I do this video series, one of them I remember it was one of my favorite books at the time. I loved the characters. I loved the plot. The twist at the end was oh so spooky and unseen. And I loved the relationships between the characters. I probably read this book half a dozen times before I finally just put it aside. Well, I had a wild hair, decided to reread it last fall, and let me tell you, reading it from the perspective of a 41-year-old woman as opposed to the 16, 17-year-old I was when it first came out, that book's got some problems. So that inspired me to do Nostalgia Reads, where I plan on reading those books those teen horror genre books from the 90s that I loved so much when I was a teenager, now with the perspective of being a grown-up adult. So I plan on rereading those, and I could probably, they're so short. I mean, Stranger with My Face is, it's this short. It's less than 300 pages, so I can knock this out in a weekend, probably do 2 per video. But seriously, the subtitle of that series is going to be Where Are the Freaking Adults? Because that's all I could say when I was rereading this book was, where the hell are the adults in this? There is so much going wrong, and it's all a bunch of like late teens, early 20s people trying to figure out this, and they need some adults. So that's what I've got going on this year. I hope to read a lot of literature, complete my fantasy bingo board, reread some stories that seriously need to be rewritten and add some adults into the mix. And hopefully this will help me get to my goal of at least 40 books read for the year. So thanks for watching. Read well.